you got to take the whole man. You got to read all the stuff that he wrote, early stuff. Evangelii Gaudium, which was the apostolic exhortation. When they would have these synods, there would be a document produced as a result of these synods, and the first synod that the Pope was involved in, Pope Francis, he then produced what, on the whole, is a good document. There are problems with it as well, but Evangelii Gaudium, the joy of the gospel. In my judgment, over time, there's just more lack of clarity. Let me read you a sentence from Pope Paul VI wrote in 1964. This was during the Second Vatican Council, which was 1962, 1965. He wrote an encyclical called Ecclesiam Suum, and he stipulated in that encyclical that one of the proper characteristics of dialogue is clarity. And so he says, clarity before all else. The dialogue demands that what is said should be intelligible. We can think of it as a kind of thought transfusion, he says. It is an invitation to the exercise and development of the highest spiritual and mental powers a man possesses, and so on and so on. Now, in my judgment, I say, this was in my book, not that book, although I did say that. This was in this more recent book of mine that I sent you on Jesus Christ, Scandal of Particularity. I said, respectfully, throughout the second edition of my book, Pope Francis Legacy Vatican II, I have shown that clarity is precisely one of the virtues lacking in Francis' writings, homilies, and the like. Now, it's also
so that was fairly across the, because a lot of people might just be familiar with the sound bites from the media, but you're saying that also in sermons, writings, and documents that he produced, that there was a similar kind of lack of clarity.
There's a similar kind of lack of. See, I reject where people say, and I know many people, friends of mine, people just misunderstand Francis. I don't believe that. I don't believe it's a misunderstanding. Let me give you an example.
Or that people are just getting partial bits here and there because they're not looking at his whole body of work.
No. Yeah. Well, you definitely have to read the whole body of work. No question about it. But to give you an example, when Francis talks about interreligious dialogue, he says, you engage in the dialogue, you bring the full content of Christian commitment to the dialogue. You want to try to understand, as Benedict said, the otherness of the other in his own thinking. Okay. But then what Francis said is that you have to, and whenever I say this, and whenever I tell people this, they just say, how could he say this? And he says it in several places. He says, you have to, when you engage in interreligious dialogue, you have to withdraw your claim to the absoluteness of your and validity of your beliefs.
Yeah, I remember we talked about that the last time we met. Yeah.
So I've had a conversation with someone who just said, "Oh, well, you're not understanding him properly." Blah blah blah. Well, on the one hand, maybe all that Francis is saying is that as you can find elements of truth, fragments of truth in other religions. But here's the bottom line. If Christianity is true, if the central claims of Christianity are true, then Islam is false.
Yeah.
There's just no way that you can somehow say that Islam and Christianity are just giving a different account of things. There are competing truth claims and so on. I argue this also because I wrote something about it, but it's also in this book of mine. In Fratelli Tutti, this is the Pope's encyclical dealing with, brotherhood and, unity among men and so on and so on. and particularly in the context where there's there's pluralism and so on and so on. I just think, I'm sorry. I said to a friend of mine, I'm sorry. No, when the Pope says you have to withdraw your claims to absolute truth and validity, there's no other way to understand him but that he's saying that Christian truth claims are not absolute. That's why he doesn't talk about, as the Pontifical Council for Promoting Christian Unity, the Pontifical Council for Interreligious Dialogue makes clear, yes, general revelation, God's revelation of himself in and through the works of creation. God has not left himself without witness. So we can read the Quran, other religious documents, and we can find fragments of truth there, because God has not left himself without witness. But then the Pontifical Council says, but let's not forget that there are also competing and conflicting truth claims, that there are contradictions there between Christianity and these other religions. So we can't just make it. We can't. So that's missing. To me, that's missing in.
Right, and that would be important for, and this is important, I think, for evangelicals to understand. I mean, I've been reading straight through the Church Fathers, and then I was reading a short book by Gerald McDermott.
Oh yeah, he's a good friend of mine.
The Church Father. It's called God's Rivals, and he's giving an account of, and I think he references Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, Origen, and one other, Clement of Alexandria.
Right.
Their views of why God allowed the pagan religions.
Right.
And even more recently, I'm reading some history of the missionaries coming over to Mexico and then engaging with the pagan Aztec religions. There's always a recognition that either, through common grace, general revelation and common grace, that the human mind can recognize some truths. Right.
God has not left himself without witness. That's what it says in the Acts of the Apostles.
But also equally, the Church Fathers and Catholic missionaries come into the New World recognize that there are obvious distortions. Right. You want to ascribe that directly to Satan, that the devil and his minions are introduce false beliefs into the minds of men, or it's just our sin nature suppressing truth and unrighteousness, or some combination of the two. There are clear and obvious errors that need to be addressed and shown to be false in light of the absoluteness of the gospel, right?
Well, that's you see. So I say that in my book. I say, despite the fact that you have general revelation or common grace, and you have, you're going to find elements of truth there, and et cetera, et cetera. Sin has been at work in the world. And so religious traditions, notwithstanding their positive values, reflect the limitations of the human spirit, sometimes inclined to choose evil. John Paul II says that in an address that he gave prior to, the Assisi meeting in 86. The presence of sin and evil, I say, is recognized. Despite general revelation, its human reception is open to resistance, and hence to distortion, misinterpretation, and rejection. There was also, this whole business. I also discussed this, the idea of a Christology of religions, where people think, from the Gospel of John, John 1, where they talk about, that the Logos lights all men who come, all men in the world, and this sort of thing. And here too, if you look at Nostra Aetate, I remember Benedict once saying in his last address, he said, I love Nostra Aetate, he said, but we have to recognize that nothing that Nostra Aetate said was false, but it was insufficient. because it had too positive a view of non-Christian religions.
Okay, so I want to segue in. Well, go ahead, Lenny. But I want to segue into something. I want to talk about the Amazon sit in 2019. But Lenny, go ahead.
In looking at this, it strikes me as it's more dangerous. Of course, counterfeits are going to have aspects that are identical to the original. You don't assume monopoly money is real currency because it's so different. So when you see, even in biblical times, right, when Israel comes out from Egypt and they build the golden calf, Aaron says, "This is Yahweh, and Yahweh is the God who's delivered you." Right. And so he's got part of that right, but the problem isn't the part that he has right. The danger becomes that the part that he has wrong is leading to death. It's leading to, and to me, that's a bigger caution. When you get closer to the truth, but you aren't the truth, the ability to lead folks astray is increased.
It's greater.
Not diminished. And that's why this kind of thing and those intentional vagaries concern me, because they're intentional vagaries.
Ed, that's good. Perfect segue. I want to talk about this because we did a episode when Fiducia Supplicans came out, and we did talk about that, this practice of blessing individuals in same-sex unions and all how that looked and the optics of it all and everything. I don't think we've talked about this yet in detail, but one of the things that I thought was fairly astounding to me was the Amazon Synod. I think it was 2019, right? And there was a lot of controversy that erupted around that synod. There were, these effigies of Pachamama that were being placed in Santa Maria della Ponte, I think one of the churches by the bridge there, to the point of where these two kids from Austria, like took a train down from Vienna, walked into the church,
threw it in the water,
into the Tiber River. I was almost in reformational zeal, I wanted to say. But then there was
an example of confusion again. Whatever the intent, it's certainly confusing.
The practice, and I mean, there was this ceremony in the Vatican Gardens with the planting of a sacred tree, and I think there was a dance. But then I think, and I remember, what's the guy's name? Moynihan, who's got the Vatican report, the Moynihan report. He writes a lot about this. And that at the presentation, the final mass to close out that Amazon Synod, when the offerings came up, and I remember this from being an altar boy when I was a kid, when the offerings came up, it was the, obviously the water and the wine and the Eucharist, the hosts. And there was a woman that came up in her traditional Incan garb or Amazonian garb with this pot of dirt with some plants in it from, I guess, her home soil. And if I remember correctly, the potted plant, the for them sacred dirt, was put on top of the altar. Wasn't put even before the altar. Was put on the altar next to the elements, and it stayed there even through, for Catholic, the blessing and transubstantiation of the elements. Now, to me, that was, and I'm not Catholic anymore, but to me that was a fairly, talk about confusion, because if I were to think here, if I'm a Catholic, I'm taking the sacrament seriously. Here's the body and blood of the Lord and Savior Jesus Christ on the altar next to a pot of dirt, sacred dirt, which is
makes no sense. My judgment makes no sense. Let me make a distinction here, because I think you can find throughout the history of the church, certainly in the early church fathers, the idea where you're appropriating elements from the culture, the so-called where you take things. It's like Aquinas
plundering Egypt, right? Augustine's term, I think.
Yeah, right, exactly. So you're doing that, but the fact is, it has to be transformed. It has to be transformed in the light of the gospel. It's like Aquinas in his treatise on what's his name, on the Trinity. Anyway, he says at one point about the relationship between philosophy and theology, he says, the relationship is such, it's not like mixing water and wine, he says. It's like water being transformed into wine. And so, you have throughout the history of our culture, you have theologians, Christian theologians, philosophers, they've engaged, Augustine engages the Platonist, the Neoplatonist, and the same thing with Aquinas and many. And closer to our own times, you had, John Paul II and Benedict, but John Paul II, he appropriated elements of the phenomenological tradition, and so on and so on, all of those things. But they have to be transformed. It's not just because you have to ask. We're not eclectics, you see. Yeah. In Fides et Ratio, his 98th encyclical, he discusses eclecticism, and he says we're not eclectics because we're not just bringing these things together. We have to understand how they hang together in the system that we're discussing, you see, and they have to be transformed in the light of the gospel, in the light of the Christian tradition, and so on. So, all this business about the Pachamama and all this, to me, that's just a total. This is a total confusion that you think you have to affirm this culture. Without
its reverence for the divinity of the earth, which, blah blah blah, and blah, blah. I mean, there was well, it's just one of the other. I think
the earth is not divine. The first thing to say,
but it's the primary. It's
I know
the primary confusion.
It's confusion. It's total confusion. Those things are just totally mislead people. Not because you don't think that you not because we don't think that we can learn something from these other traditions, these other cultures, but as we do that, they have to be transformed. You have to engage critically. You can't. One may say, "Wow, I've learned a lot from from Kant's grounding of the metaphysics of morals," but you can't just be a Kantian as a Christian. Whatever it is that you think you've learned, there has to be a kind of a critical appropriation of this. Right. It can't just be, I'm just baptizing, as people sometimes say. That's why I always quote Aquinas. Aquinas says the relationship is such that you are not. It's not water and wine. It's water being transformed into wine, and so you're transforming, the thoughts of what's his name, of Kant or whoever, of Edmund Husserl or Heidegger or whatever.
I mean, do you think Francis's background as a Jesuit plays at all into this? Does that, because I don't know the history of the Jesuits that well. Now, certainly they started out as counter-reformers, right? But there seems to be this tradition, it's even in Pascal's provincial letters, of sort of elevating context over content. I don't know how else to put it, like where you start qualifying the theological content of doctrine with, and making all these qualifications for the context of the person in their cultural situation and in their place and time and et cetera, et cetera.
Well, there is that. That's why that, in that synod, that extraordinary synod that John Paul II called, one of the principles was we can't oppose doctrine and pastoral context. And the tendency is, I think, in fact, I talk about that in my book, a pastorality of doctrine approach, you see, where it's all about, that's how wrongly interpreted, that the law of evangelization, as I mentioned earlier, from the Gaudium et Spes, the Pastoral Constitution of the Church in the Modern World, where the idea is that you understand the gospel in the light of the context and all that. To me, what happened there is that people then take the project to be, we're just always reinterpreting and recontextualizing the gospel, the teachings of the church. And so the church becomes purely a listening church.
Mm-hmm. And not a teaching church.
To a teaching church.
Yeah.
Well, and this is the second caution that I've seen as well, because I think that many people, both in laity, but more importantly within, say, the media, have assumed that, and they at least hope to assume that they felt that there is something with Francis that gave them a unique opportunity to move Roman Catholicism more towards a progressive ideal than had been available in the past. And, we talked a little bit about this offline, where I think that they did it in a twofold way. First of all, they praised Francis throughout the media. He was, matter of fact, there's even an LA Times article that ran on the 22nd, just a couple of days ago, where it's written by the man who describes himself as a lapsed gay Catholic on how he loves Pope Francis.
Well, he loves Pope Francis because he sees Pope Francis taking photos,
yes,
with promoters of homosexuality and so on. He sees right. Pope Francis. Here's another thing. Just if I may interrupt you, in my judgment, you're lost if you start speaking of the LGBT community.
Right.
Because that just assumes the legitimacy of a person's identity as being homosexual or lesbian.
Right. And that's
fundamentally grounded in their sexual desires.
The problem with that community is that's how they fundamentally see themselves. They see that as a fundamental issue. And you can go all the way back to the first council, right? The Jerusalem Council. Sexual immorality was one of the four thou shalt not. I mean, they look, we'll give Gentiles a whole lot of leeway, but this sexual immorality thing, that's one that we're sticking with. So, but my point being that the press played this up, and this is a concern for me. Jesus said, they will hate you because they hated me. A student is not greater than his master. If they persecuted me, they'll persecute you. Francis got no persecution. And that's a big red flag for me. But the press, I think, did this purposely in order to move a second point. And that second point was to, because they were rewarding him, so to speak, with positive coverage, with accolades, with ways of commendation instead of condemnation, which they had done in the past. They're hoping maybe that this will generate sympathies along these same lines within possibly cardinals, possibly folks who are next in line.